Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Between the 1970s and 1990s, the United States saw the greatest proliferation of serial killers, ranging from Charles Manson and Ted Bundy to Dennis Rader, known as the BTK killer, to Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker. I remember these years well as a kid, watching the evening news with my mom each night, looking for updates and many of these serial killers. I remember very well checking the windows and doors at night, trying to make sure that they were locked when the Night Stalker was terrorizing both Northern and Southern California. My guest today, Pulitzer Prize winning author Caroline Fraser, has written a book examining this period of time between the 1970s and 1990s and looks at how environmental factors may have played a key role in quite a violent era. The book is called Muderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. Caroline Fraser, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I said this before we began, but I'll repeat it again here. Preparing for our conversation really did take me back to my childhood. I very well remember, it seemed like on a nightly basis, watching the evening news with my mom, looking for updates about these serial killers. I remember making sure, when I was a kid, I was looking to make sure the windows were locked, the doors were locked when we went to bed each night. And, when you're a kid, things that are abnormal, if they're happening fairly often, seem normal. They seem normal to you. So I never really thought about this period of time being an outlier in time. But I do realize we don't nearly talk, we do on TV shows looking back at this period of time, but we don't nearly talk as often today about current serial killers. I can't think of other serial killers in the past, like maybe Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac Killer, that might predate this period of time. But can you talk to me more about what differentiates these 20 years between the 70s and 90s from other periods when it comes to this issue?
Yeah, I think, I didn't realize it at the time, just as you didn't. I was a, kid growing up in the 60s and 70s. And to me, it also seemed normal just because that was the way things were. But in fact, looking back at this era from the 70s to the early 90s was the highest rate of crime in the sort of recent period of American history. And that includes today. We did have a spike in crime during COVID, but it never reached the heights that it reached in the 70s and 80s. And that's violent crime. And there were also more serial killers. And I think that because it just was happening in real time, people weren't, people were disturbed by it, and politicians were talking about it, but there was never really an explanation for it. And so when I started writing this book, one of the questions I was looking at was, why are there so many serial killers in the Pacific Northwest? Because that had been a question that was raised sort of over and over again in that region after, Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer in the 80s and 90s. And that was really something I wanted to kind of explore, was to see, is there any possible explanation for this phenomenon?
And you write about this in the introduction about a map and how it all comes together when you look at the map. Tell me more about the connection between serial killers and the Northwest portion of the United States.
Yeah, I give a sort of a brief list of the number of the serial killers during that period, which was constantly being kind of reiterated in the newspapers. But I was always interested in this question, but it wasn't until, I don't know, 2015 or 16 that I became aware that Washington State had produced a kind of really fascinating map of what they called the Tacoma smelter plume, which related to a smelter that had been operating for decades in Tacoma, the city of Tacoma, which is, only about 30 miles south of Seattle. And, looking at Tacoma and looking at where, Ted Bundy grew up, he grew up in Tacoma. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, also grew up quite close to there. He grew up just a couple miles east of SeaTac Airport. And I also learned around this time that Charles Manson had been incarcerated on McNeil Island, which was one of those old federal island prisons in the early 60s for about 5 years.
And this is before he would become the Charles Manson we know of.
That's right. Yes, this was directly before. And, looking at those coincidences of, because these guys were all very close in relationship to each other, about 5 to 7 miles away from each other, growing up at the same time. And that just struck me as something unusual. I mean, it just kind of made me ask, well, is this just a coincidence or is there something more to this? And when I became aware of that plume map, I started looking at that and looking at where these guys lived in relationship to the pollution that the smelter put out. And one of the things about that pollution was that it included tons of lead particulates that were going up the smokestack at this smelter, which had originally been a lead smelter and switched to copper. But smelting, the production of metal, produces all kinds of different metals. And this was very widespread in that period. In San Francisco, there was a lead smelter up by the North Bay area. And so I started looking at the effects that might have. And one of the things that lead is associated with is if you're exposed to it as a child, it can cause aggression and violence and juvenile delinquency later in life.
And there is a hypothesis out there about this connection between violence and lead. And does a hypothesis include serial killers?
It has begun to include them, and what happened was that after this very sharp rise in the rate of violent crime in the 70s and 80s, this again, you would need to remember that period was also the period in which leaded gas was sold to everybody. And so everybody's driving around and commuting in cars using leaded gas.
So it's not just coming from smelters, it's coming from everywhere.
That's
now.
right.
Yeah.
Yes. And so virtually everybody who's born between the 1950s and the 1980s has been exposed to more lead than you would like to be exposed to, because the only safe level of lead is 0. And so one of the things that scientists began noticing, after leaded gas was removed from the market, and it's fully removed by the early 90s, the rate of violent crime drops off sharply. And so scientists looked at that and said, and more sharply than they had ever seen before. And so people were very surprised by that, and attributed some measure of that to the removal of leaded gas. And so then the so-called lead crime hypothesis was born. This is one of the explanations for that drop-off in crime. Although there are other explanations. If you've read a book called Freakonomics, they talk about, the availability of abortion is one theory. Police departments were quick to claim credit for that, for their, exacerbated policing and the rise in mass incarceration and so forth.
Tough on crime era in the 90s.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. The Clinton era of incarceration. So, there's a healthy debate that's gone on about this. But I wanted to look at the lead crime hypothesis. And more recently, scientists have done some studies that have linked psychopaths and psychopathy to lead exposure.
That drop off of violent crime in the 1990s that seemed to correspond with the banning of lead and dramatically reducing the amount of lead in the air is interesting to me, because when I think of lead, I think of it as something that's damaging to children, that will damage children during development, and then it's sort of permanent. But to have that drop off suggests that there's also kind of, I guess, an active ingredient or an active thing happening in the moment to lead exposure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the levels of lead in the blood of American children fell rapidly as soon as they got rid of leaded gas. And at the same time, many of the smelters in the U.S. began closing because they could no longer operate under, OSHA or EPA regulations, and they just were becoming impossible to operate in a financially advantageous way for the companies. And so you see all the closure of all of those all across the country. So that as well, lowered the amount of lead in our blood levels.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, and I was thinking about Charles Manson as well. He didn't necessarily grow up next to a smelter plant, but he was, as you mentioned, imprisoned for a number of years near one. I guess do you think that lead also, even if does it have an active ingredient to it in its time? And so in the 90s, if you have this reduction of lead in the air and a reduction in crime, it seems like a reduction in lead. If that connection is true, then it would suggest to me just having lead in your blood at the time could be detrimental, not just for development.
Yeah, and the thing about lead is that it does not pass out of the body naturally. I mean, you actually have to be treated with a whole regimen of in order to get it out of your body. And one of the things that happens if you're exposed to lead is that it ends up getting stored in your bones and in your teeth. And so it stays with you. It stays in the environment. It doesn't, wash away with the next rain or something like that. It's a very permanent form of, contaminant. I mean, it just stays where it falls. And this was the huge problem in the Northwest because it had contaminated about 1,000 square miles of the Puget Sound region.
So I apologize for keep harping on this. I just don't think I'm articulating it very well. With the reduction of lead in the air corresponding with a reduction of violent crime, if it takes people a number of years, or if you never even really get rid of that lead, why such a sharp reduction then when lead? Why wouldn't it take decades for this reduction in crime to happen if it was connected?
Yeah, there's about a 20-year lag because what happens is if you're exposed to lead as a small child, which is really the sort of worst time to be exposed to it, it affects the development of your frontal cortex. And this is they found that it's particularly pronounced in men, that it affects the development of the organs in the brain that control behavior, that control aggression. And this is why they see more violence in children who've been exposed. And you can start to see that violence pretty soon after exposure, but then about 20 years later, when the kid has grown up, when the child reaches the age of, 20 or 25, that's when you can measure the rate of juvenile delinquency and violent crime. And scientists have done this over and over and over again. They can show this on MRIs, imaging, and you can see that there are deficits in the frontal cortex of people who've been exposed. It shows up in women as well, but to a somewhat lesser extent. But they have produced studies that show during this critical period in the 70s and 80s that, for example, teenage pregnancies among girls also skyrocketed during that period.
And
So I'm not sure if that goes to your question.
I find out what you brought up was very important, and I did want to talk about the teenage pregnancies as well, because that's an interesting correlation that's happening at the same time. And I guess it's theorizing that's over impulse.
Yes.
Yeah.
Impulsivity, and just controlling your own behavior, having a kind of sense of, should I take risks or not?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the
I guess what I was just trying to get at, I don't want to stay on it too much longer, but what I was just trying to get at is lead being in you? Let's say you're beyond the developmental stage. You're now in your 20s. I'm assuming that's sort of where Charles Manson was. Now he's being imprisoned for 5 years next to this smelter. Would just having lead in you as an active agent be something that could make you violent, or is it something that's concerning specifically towards development of the brain, of having to be exposed to it at an early age?
I think both.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about Manson is that he grew up in real poverty in a coal producing town. Coal has a lot of the similar issues. When you burn coal, you're producing gases that include heavy metals. We don't know what happened to Charles Manson. I mean, obviously, a lot of bad things happened to him in his childhood. He was abandoned, had a incredibly unstable existence, and I think that when you talk about this, the lead crime hypothesis and what happens to these guys, you do have to acknowledge that there are a whole host of things that can go into producing this kind of behavior. I think lead exposure is one, but scientists have also written about the role of poverty. If you grow up with a really poor diet and don't have access to a lot of vitamins and minerals in your diet, that affects your brain development on top of anything else. If you grow up with physical or sexual abuse, those things can really trigger a lot of impulsive and risk-taking behavior and violent behavior later. So there's a whole host of things that go into this, I think.
Yeah. Richard Ramirez is interesting. This is the Night Stalker. He's not from the Northwest. He's from El Paso, Texas,
Right.
Which was also near a smelter plant, wasn't it?
Yes, and in fact, the same company, the same corporation, which was the American Smelting and Refining Company, owned by the Guggenheim family, they had smelters all over the country and especially all over the West. And they had a smelter in Tacoma, which was producing a lot of, lead, copper, and arsenic. But they also had a huge smelter in El Paso, right on the border between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And that smelter, too, produced an enormous plume of pollutants that covered a whole area of El Paso. And Richard Ramirez grew up, about 5 miles from that smokestack. And he also grew up right next to I-10, a heavily traveled corridor that was itself producing a lot of pollution from leaded gas.
As you mentioned, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez are basically neighbor cities separated by a border. Ciudad Juarez was well known in the 1990s as one of the murder capitals of the world, especially a dangerous place for women.
Yes. Yes, that whole period of what they called the femicides, in which, at least several hundred women were murdered in the 80s and 90s. There was a theory that there were several serial killers at work, but there was also a lot of, cartel violence, domestic violence. So the murder rate in Juarez was really striking and was called out by all kinds of different, organizations from the UN to, more local, regional things. But it was really quite striking. And they had made some attempt in El Paso to do a limited cleanup for the smokestack, but to my knowledge, there was never any cleanup in Juarez. They were just left with the pollution that had crossed over the border.
And people are very vulnerable in Ciudad Juarez. That's where many people go to try to get a visa to get into the United States. So you have a lot of people from out of other countries or other parts of Mexico. Very vulnerable situation there. I've been there once, and it was very apparent from what I saw. And this was like in 2001. So just a little bit after the 1990s. This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Caroline Fraser. She is the author of the book Muderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. I do want to stay on the topic of the experience of women between the 1970s and the 1990s. This is a time, we're talking about serial killers, but this is also a time is this also a time, I should put this in a question because I'm assuming, is this also a time of heightened domestic violence?
Um, I'm not sure that I've seen the graphs on domestic violence. I think that, as with rape, domestic violence was not reported as much in earlier decades as it is now. I think in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, it was much less talked about. People didn't have even sometimes, I think, a language to talk about it. They didn't recognize how prevalent it was. And and I think there was also, as with rape, a lot of shame around the topic. People didn't want to admit it. People didn't, women especially, I think, were afraid to try to seek help for it. And of course, you have to remember that this is during a time when all of the issues around rape, including the reporting of it and rape laws, were only just starting to change. And it was only starting to be recognized, as the serious crime that it is. And at in the 70s, it was much less likely to be taken seriously by police, unless you could prove that there had been real violence, a beating or an attack with a, you know, knife or something like that. It was often very hard to get it taken seriously as a crime.
This is a personal story for you, not necessarily a connection to a serial killer, but the violence of this period of time and domestic violence. Your father was a violent man.
Yeah, he was somebody who was very, he's very religious, very devout Christian Zionist, and very controlled and controlling. And so he didn't often kind of lash out, but occasionally he would sort of lose control, and there would be this very dramatic, incident. Or he would, I think do things behind closed doors. My mother later told me, that he had hit her a couple of times. And I never quite knew what to make of that, if she was minimizing what had happened or if that was in fact true, that it only happened a couple of times. He wasn't violent on a daily basis, but he was scary. He was a scary guy. And I think, I knew a lot of other people at that time who had fathers who were a little bit, on edge and could be frightening sometimes. And so I think that was kind of a thing at the time. And I described him and his behavior as a way of giving a little bit of a picture of that era and how, male behavior could be on a sort of a spectrum. There were people like my father who was not a criminal. I mean, he was not uh, ever arrested for anything. But on the other hand, he was a little bit frightening. And then, there's a whole spectrum of behavior that stretches on the other extreme to the serial killers that I'm talking about.
I mean, I didn't expect to be preparing for a conversation about serial killers and thinking about how it affects my life as well. I'm sure you didn't either. But my father was a violent man. I was born in the early 70s. My earliest memories are of my mom screaming at night. You think, so when you say it was kind of a thing, I mean, it certainly was a thing for me. You think that lead exposure could have had a role in that, in men during that period?
I wonder about it. I don't think it can be proven, maybe, but I wonder about that. I wonder about, the violence in American society generally, especially during that era. Um, and of course, it was sort of taken for granted. I mean, we were coming out of centuries of sort of the male prerogative of, men were thought to be the head of the household and they could do as they pleased, and it was okay to spank your kids or spank them at schools. I mean, that all of that kind of plays into this as well. There were just certain expectations that those kinds of behaviors were maybe normal or expected, or if that's what the father wanted to do, that was okay.
Yeah, I don't, you think of these things as normal, and maybe they were normal. I mean, maybe this is how it was in the 40s and the 30s as well, but certainly growing up, I remember, yeah, I think me and my friends, we were all scared of the men in the family. Had a fear there. You mentioned earlier the Guggenheims and the Rockefellers. How do they play in this narrative that you tell?
Well, they, of course, were, at the turn of the last century, they were the big powers in mining in the West, and there was a kind of power struggle between those two families, between who was going to own the mines and who was going to own the smelters. And the way it kind of shook out was that they both ended up owning some of each, but the Guggenheims really specialized in smelting and ended up buying up a lot of the smelters, including some that had belonged to the Rockefellers, and that's how they ended up with some smelters in Washington State. There was a smelter in Everett that they bought, and in Tacoma. They closed the operation in Everett and moved some of it down to Tacoma. And the thing about the Tacoma smelter that was really notable was that it was a very, very dirty, I mean, they're all dirty, but the Tacoma smelter was particularly dirty. They were mining ores that were full of arsenic, and arsenic is not unknown in these plants because it's found along with lead and copper, but this was particularly heavy in arsenic, and the Tacoma smelter began producing a lot of this white inorganic arsenic for use in pesticides and fertilizers and things, and um, that was used heavily in the 40s and 50s on, in fruit orchards in Washington State, Oregon, California, with the unfortunate outcome that now those communities do have arsenic and lead in their soil. There was a lead arsenate pesticide that was used quite heavily. So, this is a community in Tacoma that had both tons of lead and tons of arsenic. And the the family, the Guggenheim family and the smelter, basically did this sort of whole propaganda thing of trying to convince people that arsenic is really not a big problem, which seems extraordinary now.
You can find those advertisements and those things online.
Yeah,
It's pretty
yeah.
extraordinary.
And, I mean, it's been known as a poison for centuries, but
I mean, I don't mean to get you to talk about current politics. It's not the aim of having you on, but I still couldn't help listening to you thinking about how right now there's a push to deregulate industries
yeah.
and sort of thinking about toxins in the environment and how they may actually affect us and behavior.
And that is related to these issues because the smelters are no longer around, but there are still mines. There's a particularly notable mine in Idaho that they're thinking of reopening that I talk a little bit about. But yeah, the whole issue of cleaning up lead in our environment, the Biden administration was very invested in that and had made some pretty serious commitments to trying to clean up lead in, baby food. And there's a lot of old elementary schools and public schools across the country that have lead in pipes. There are, lead pipes in communities. Lead paint problems are still out there in housing. But I'm, you know, sad to say that I assume that that's all being undone at the moment with the current administration, and that's a real shame. That stuff needs to be cleaned up, and it shouldn't be a political issue.
In Murderland, you take a deep look into Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is one of the most famous serial killers. What caused you to dive back into his story?
Well, one of the things was because he was so famous. I mean, one of the ways in which the true crime genre has sort of treated him is to almost sort of glamorize him as a sort of genius figure. This happens a lot, I think, in the especially in the Hollywood or film portrayals of him, that he emerges as this kind of incredibly cunning character who can evade detection and so forth, and becomes this kind of Hannibal Lecter-like character who's smarter than everybody else. And so I wanted to take a good look at him because, in fact, if you look at the real Ted Bundy, he's not a glamorous figure. He's a rapist and abductor of girls. He preyed on 12-year-old girls. He raped and mutilated his victims. And I wanted to just, in a matter of fact way, describe who he was and what he did to kind of bring him back to earth in an accurate way and show who he really was. And also against the background of a whole lot of other guys who were doing the same kind of thing at the same time, which I think is so striking. I mean, he got so much attention in the 70s that I think it hasn't really been noticed that there were a number of other serial killers operating in, for example, 1974 on the I-5 corridor in Washington State. And Bundy became so famous that, the crimes of these other guys were attributed to him because people just didn't understand how much this was happening. But now that we do know that, I think it again causes you to say, well, what was this phenomenon? What caused it to happen? Did it have anything to do with light exposure?
What do you think about the way we talk about serial killers, the way we respond about serial killers, the way we all watch television shows about serial killers? I'm not going to lie to you, Caroline Fraser. When we got our hands on your book, Murderland, both me and my producer were like, "Oh yeah, serial killers. Let's do this." Everyone loves serial killers, right? I mean, what?
Well, I think it's part of, the true crime genre and our fascination with murder, which is a very, old, um, I mean, it has existed since, the Bible. The Bible's full of murder. Homer is full of murder. I mean, we are fascinated by murder as human beings because I think it's a very, kind of atavistic, primitive urge to understand that whole predator prey feeling, which, we can be on either side of. And it's obviously, uh, more advantageous to be a predator than to be prey. And so I think we're all fascinated by it, we're entertained by it. Um, and I think we just the stories about it are endlessly appealing because we're, always engaged in this kind of effort to understand what's going on.
And yet there's another side, obviously, to this. What we were talking about is you focus a lot on the experience of women between this period of time, between the 1970s and the 1990s. Is it true that women, conversely, are sort of like the biggest audience and even creators of media about
Yeah,
coverage over serial killers?
there's been a huge shift in that because when true crime originated in the, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was largely produced and consumed by men, and it was in, true crime, true detective magazine. There were dozens of magazines that were sold in drugstores to men, and it was almost a kind of soft core porn. If you look at the covers of these magazines, they show, women in distress and being strangled or threatened with a knife or something. And these images sort of proliferated, and I think the sleaziness of true crime attached during that period. But then, starting, I think, with Anne Rule and her book about Bundy, The Stranger Beside Me. She was actually a person who wrote for those detective magazines under a male pseudonym.
Hmm.
But The Stranger Beside Me, she wrote under her own name. And of course, she had known Bundy before he was arrested and had been friends with him. They worked side by side at a rape crisis counseling place in Seattle. And she, I think, began a kind of shift whereby women were writing about these experiences, about murder, about threats, about rape, um, and writing about it in a way that included a lot more information about victims, a lot more attention to victims. And the shift happened, I believe, because, and I think there are polls that bear this out, because I think women have that constant sense of fear, not necessarily of being attacked by a serial killer. But women are, as they just go through their daily lives, they have some experience maybe of domestic violence, but certainly of just concern. If most women have had the experience of, being out on a street late at night or in a parking lot or something like that, and having to look over your shoulder or be worried about your safety. And I think true crime has begun to be a thing about women's safety, a thing that makes women feel like they can control or take control of their own lives almost. Whether this is true or not, I don't know. But I think that women often feel like the more they know about crime, the better off they are.
Yeah. I mean, that's why we rubberneck, right? When we drive past a car,
Right.
where we're always looking at the disasters to see, for an evolutionary purpose, to see what's going on, so that we could try to avoid that. But this fear, this concern, is always in the air.
Yeah, and I think, I'm sure that men probably feel that to some extent too, but it's maybe not as open or openly acknowledged for men. It's actually a fact that more men are murdered than women, and it's male on male violence that causes a lot of that crime. So the statistics don't quite bear out some of the concern that women feel, and yet it's very real for women.
Anne Rule sounds really fascinating to me, and it reminded me that the book you won the Pulitzer Prize for is Prairie Fires: The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote Home on the Prairie.
Right, Little House on the
Little
Prairie.
House. Yeah, I should write these things down. Anne Rule, was she an entryway for you into this story?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, since I was like 13 in 1974 when Ted Bundy kind of went on this, uncontrolled binge really of abducting women in the area. And there was a particularly kind of horrifying weekend in July of 74 when two women vanished from the shore of Lake Sammamish, this popular beach, on a very busy weekend, Sunday afternoon. And, people came out with stories that said that some man named Ted had been approaching women that afternoon. And so I was aware of him from that day on and was just like everybody else in Seattle, just riveted by news of what was happening to that. He was not then arrested until the following year in Utah. And Anne Rule had already been put under contract to write a book about this mysterious Ted guy. So she didn't even know who it was when she contracted to write that book. And she had a hard time, I think, like most people who knew him, in believing that he would be capable of this kind of violence. But gradually came to believe it. And I think her experience in writing about crime for the detective magazines made her more suspicious from the start.
I remember my mom, who was born in 1954, telling me about the Zodiac Killer. That's what it was for her when she was a kid.
Yeah.
Everybody was scared of the Zodiac Killer at the time. And I'm doing this off the top of my head. I should have researched this a little bit. Like, how much do we know about the Zodiac Killer? I know it took a long time, and it might be a little obscure. But would somebody like the Zodiac Killer fit into this story?
Yeah, I do talk a little bit about Zodiac because Um, one of the theories that has emerged about him is that he may have been from the North Bay area. Benicia, I think, is one of the towns, because his first crimes seem to have been committed up there. And so they think that it's entirely possible that he was from there. There have been several people who've been singled out in the famous book about Zodiac. One of those guys grew up in the Benicia area, which, as I mentioned earlier, had a big lead smelter right up there. So you can theorize about that. We don't know who he was or where he came from, and we may never know. But it is interesting to kind of look at that region and wonder about his connections to that.
Do we not have serial killers anymore?
Oh yeah, I think there have always been serial killers. You see them throughout history. I mean, there's Jack the Ripper and various others in Europe and in Russia, and virtually all countries, I think. It was really just the numbers that went up sharply and have now dropped off again. So there are still serial killers. There just aren't as many in the news.
And this connection to environmental contamination, this is a hypothesis still, right? Because I can imagine, and I was doing this in preparing, I kept looking for the smoking gun to prove it, but I suspect there's not a smoking gun to prove it.
Yeah, I mean, there is a very powerful association between lead exposure and violent crime. That has been determined. I think people are starting to extend that to serial killers, but the smoking gun of saying, okay, this serial killer definitely did what he did because of lead. I mean, the one example that we have of that does seem pretty incontrovertible is a mass murderer, not a serial killer, but a mass shooter who was one of the first guys to do one of these mass shootings in the U.S. at a McDonald's near San Diego in the 80s. He had a basically kind of psychotic break and shot a lot of people at the McDonald's in San Isidro. And it was later discovered, had worked for many years in a plant with cadmium, which is very much like lead. It is also associated with violent crime. And when they did an autopsy on his body, they found enormous levels, very high levels of cadmium in his body. And he had gone to his bosses and earlier and told them, I think I'm going mad, because of the cadmium. And so that's a very interesting case to look at. And somebody like Bundy, I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to look at him is because we can see exactly where he grew up on the map in Washington State, and we can see how much lead and arsenic were in his front yard and his backyard, which is really kind of an extraordinary.
It's been measured.
Data point, yes, because they have done this for every address in North Tacoma and on their GIS map. So it's a very interesting question. Did that exposure affect him in any way? We can't answer that, but I think there's information that we can talk about.
I mean, it's a compelling question. It's something you wouldn't want to dismiss.
Right.
Caroline Fraser has been our guest. She has joined us for a conversation about her book. It's called Muderland, Crime and Bloodlust in the Time of Serial Killers. Caroline Fraser, that was very interesting, and I thank you very much for taking this time to talk to us.
Oh, thank you for talking to me. It's been a pleasure.